So the next speaker we have is Diego Martinez Lugo, uses he and them pronouns, and the title of their talk is Racial Capitalism and the Police State. So Diego, you have 15 minutes, and then you'll have Q&A, and then I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes and a minute left.
Diego, before you go, I just want to interrupt and say, for anyone that has a Q&A or has a question, the Q&A option is at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and ask a question, and the facilitator, Sid, will ask the questions live as time permits. So we probably won't get to all questions, but just wanted to let you know that that's an option.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen and Reshma. Hi, everyone. My name is Diego, and I would like to welcome you all to my presentation titled Racial Capitalism and the Police State. I want to first off by thanking all of the organizers who, in the face of fascist and racist violence, still labor to bring everyone together in dialogue to make this critical teaching a reality. In these tumultuous times, where the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the inherent contradictions and cruelties of capitalism, we are witnessing insurgencies across the country against state-sanctioned murder. Black Lives Matter uprisings are not only resisting the murder of Black people at the hands of the police state, but are fighting towards Black liberation and away from the violence of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. What I will be doing today is briefly analyzing the capitalist nature of policing and how policing reinforces capitalism as a means of structuring social relations. In a way, I will be speaking to how the timely calls of defunding the police, which I first need to stress that defunding the police is just a precursor to full-on abolishing the police and the police state, prisons, and US military imperialism, because as other talks today, such as Pranav's and others, will demonstrate, the terror tactics and weapons that the US perpetrates in Yemen, Syria, Palestine, and Afghanistan is intimately linked to how the US state dishes out violence domestically. So the timely calls of defunding the police are directly tied to the calls for abolishing capitalism. We cannot abolish the police without a full-fledged abolition of the economic and social relations which necessitates and demands there be an entity that uses brutal force and acute violence to protect and defend capital with impunity. And this is not coming at you from a class reductionist or economistic perspective where I am advocating for a specific fringe leftist ideology that claims to have all of the right answers. No, it is in fact abolition itself which necessitates a deconstruction that the police state functions to uphold two things. Yeah, thank you, Annabelle. No, I'll go back a little bit. No, it is in fact abolition itself which necessitates a critical deconstruction that the police state functions to uphold two things and two things only: the protection of capital and the maintenance of white supremacy. Let me repeat myself so this is clear. The police do not exist to serve or protect you from petty crime, sexual assault, or from being murdered. I mean, think about it. How can a police officer in training under the police academy learn all of the criminal injustices, systems, inner workings, and laws in a mere 4 to 6 months, whereby lawyers go into tens of thousands of dollars into debt to learn about a tiny and specific portion of the law in 3 years? So there's a discrepancy in how long it takes the enforcers of the law to be trained to enforce the law as opposed to the people who understand the law. Additionally, when you hear your racist uncle or conservative coworker blindly profess "who will stop the rapes" in response to calls to abolish the police and prisons, remind them that at least 200,000 known, untested, or unsubmitted rape kits exist in the US in what is known as the rape kit backlog. And these are 200,000 that are known rape kits that are supposed to be carried out during arrests or during complaints with the police. It is in fact our criminal injustice system who is the actual and largest protector of rapists. Now, the police as a historical institution in the colonial US functions as a kind of paramilitary force with the simple tasks of protecting physical property and enforcing territorial rights. I will not be taking a historical dive into policing, as Kristen will be doing so after my presentation, but it is important to state that the origins of policing can be traced and mapped back to slave patrols who used extrajudicial force at the time to capture self-freed slaves who refused to be the property of slave owners. My argument throughout this talk, and my main takeaway point that I want you all to leave with, is that the creation of world capitalism, again, the creation of world capitalism necessitated the creation of race as a category to better justify the organization of human beings around master slave, boss worker, and human subhuman. This is what racial capitalism is all about, as it is outlined by Cedric Robinson in his 1983 landmark book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And I suggest and recommend this book to you all if you haven't checked it out already. So then, racism does not predate capital, and capital does not predate racism. They were both necessary to the creation of racial capitalism. The social construction of race as a category was a colonial and imperial project meant to classify and organize human beings into categories and hierarchies to be dispossessed, subjugated, forced into labor and slavery, and to be outright murdered. All of this was necessary at the same time of the creation of capital, the commodity form and capitalist means of extraction and accumulation. So we cannot disentangle racism from capitalism, and thus our understanding of abolishing the police must be fueled by this. Now for a second, I would like to draw from Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolitionist geographer who does critical research on prisons at CUNY, or the City University of New York. You might have seen her recent interviews on Haymarket Books or on The Intercept. And if you haven't, I highly recommend you check them out. I'm gonna share the screen very quickly. Okay, great. So I'm going to break down each part of this definition of racism because it is so rich and expansive while also being to the point and concise. So racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So state-sanctioned refers to the essential role the state plays through the means of creating laws and policies, enforcing and enforcement through policing and judges, and funding, or the lack thereof, of certain sectors or communities. And we can understand, a way of understanding this is all of the bloated city budgets that are 90% or more going towards police. So in contrast, extra legal production refers to actions outside and not regulated by the state. Some examples are right-wing militias who patrol the border in Arizona or California, shooting at or murdering undocumented migrants crossing the harsh desert, or in more recent times, white supremacists lynching Robert Fuller and Malcolm Harsh in California. So the crux of this definition is premature death, which I will get to in a bit, but exploitation is also important because exploitation can take on so many forms, such as economic exploitation, which leads to premature death, but it also contributes in creating vulnerable conditions while living. And group differentiated just means that it isn't just individuals, but that there are specific groups of people in society. And in this case, it's racialized people. So racism leads to premature death for Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the hands of or beyond the state. This is an important definition to deconstruct because Dr. Gilmore teaches us that racism is not only a matter of individual relations, but racism is also a structure with appendages and intricate mechanisms which make it so pervasive in our society.
Diego, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks. Racism is not just about the individual actions by racists or by police. These are critical, yes, but a structural understanding of racism also encompasses how policing is an organ in the parasitic organism of capitalism, so that policing functions exactly as it should, to act as muscle for capitalism. In returning to the police and racial capitalism, we each can see with our own very own eyes the overwhelming amount of evidence of the great lengths the police go to serve and protect, not the people, but capital. Capital in the form of private property, infrastructures, and businesses. How long did the state take to act on COVID-19? An unprecedented pandemic, which has led to unemployment rates worse than the Great Depression and over 100,000 deaths in the United States alone. And compare that to the hours it took states across the nation to unleash the terror of the police on protesters. We know that the National Guard was not called in to help actual frontline workers to combat COVID-19, but to protect critical infrastructure and points of interest to the ruling class. One of the worst parts of this all is that frontline workers have systematically had their hazard pay delayed or outright refused. Meanwhile, the police have been receiving hazard pay for viciously attacking protesters with military-grade equipment. We have known for over 2 centuries that this racial capitalist, white supremacist society values property over Black lives, as Black lives were for the majority of this country property. But we are now at a critical juncture in history that necessitates understanding how entangled the system of policing is with racism and capitalism. Just a week before the brutal execution of George Floyd took place, white supremacists armed to the teeth stormed state capitals to demand brown and Black people, not themselves, go back to being indentured servants. Where were the police then? Protecting white supremacist protesters. The police only act as peacekeepers when the people doing the protesting are brown or Black, or are fighting for the lives of brown and Black peoples. Now, I also find it important to briefly speak to the narrative surrounding violence and peaceful protesters that have been co-opted by the media and weaponized by the state. The destruction of property is not violence. Looting is not violence. Protests only turn into riots when the police shows up in full tactical riot gear, shooting lethal bullets covered in rubber at protesters, blinding protesters with so-called tear gas, which is a chemical agent banned in warfare, according to the Geneva Convention, and the use of other brutal, violent tactics to suppress protests. As an aside, tear gas is not actually gas, but it is a fine powder that is heated and mixed with a solvent and released as an aerosol that causes intense burning in the eyes, lungs, skin, and mucous membranes, and in many cases leading to blinding.
1 minute.
We could have an entire teaching about the inhumane cruelty of unleashing tear gas, which destroys the lungs during a pandemic. The peaceful protester and its antithetical outside agitator narrative has been used time and time again to justify the deadly use of force against anarchists and anti-fascists, and to treat all dissidents as political terrorists. And we see this as Antifa being deemed a terrorist organization by the Trump administration. Resisting settler, colonial, and imperialist violence will always be a form of violence, as Fanon famously stated in Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon. Because the current social and economic conditions that subjugate Black and colonized people are inherently violent, but also any form of resistance will also always be deemed violent in the eyes of the oppressors. I now turn to abolitionism, and I now end on abolitionism as an ethic, ideology, and movement which works to deconstruct and abolish the social, economic, and ecological conditions that give rise to the need to cage human beings and lock away social problems in prisons, and the need for a multi-billion-dollar industry with the sole purpose of using lethal force to protect property and capital, policing. How we imagine a world without policing necessitates an imagining of a world without capitalism, a world where private property does not exclude, a world where, as Dr. Wilson Gilmore has stated, when life is precious, life is precious. This requires viewing Black life and Black lives as precious and racial capitalism as one of many threats to dismantle. Abolition, then, is a generative process. Abolition is not just the tearing down or the destroying or the dismantling. It is the dreaming, the power of the imaginary, and the creation of alternative worlds where there is no need for policing. As the Zapatistas have stated, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many worlds fit. Thank you.
That was fire. Okay, thank you so much. So now I think you're gonna have like 3 to 4 minutes for Q&A. So maybe the facilitator can get on, and if you can answer like 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sid should be on for Q&A. Sid, let me know if you can't turn on audio or video.
It looks like Sid got
I have video, but
blocked.
yeah, it keeps telling me the host has stopped my video, but maybe that's fine.
I just asked to start
There
your
it goes.
video.
Okay. Yeah, we're good. Okay. Well, first, thank you, Diego. I think that's brilliant. And I think it's so important that we are connecting capitalism to hierarchy, that necessity. And we have multiple questions, basically, first wanting to clarify that the book you mentioned when you were talking about the necessity of race to capitalism, Black Marxism is the one.
Yeah.
And then do you have any other further readings about the ability to, or the creation of race for the purposes of capitalism?
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a way for us to send, like the bibliography that the presenters have created to people who registered. But the book is, so I'll send that all to you, but I'll repeat it. The 1983 book by Cedric Robinson is called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And there are a lot of really good entryways into understanding the construction of race and capital. Another one that is really good that I recommend folks check out is Angela Davis's, I always mix up the title, but it's Women, Class, and Race. And Angela Davis being a Marxist, understands how race, gender, and class were created together. And I could, to answer the rest of the question, I could dig through some other readings that I have at different,
Yeah, I
and
think it'd
send
be
that
great
out to
to
folks.
be able to set up a list for the registered people later. I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah, and then I'll repeat if you look up Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, either on the Intercept, that's INTERCEPT, or on Haymarket Books. She did 2 separate interviews that are really digestible and to the point as well.
Cool. And then another question that we have is whether you know of any particular programming for alternative policing, basically, or what we have called or assume policing is supposed to be,
Sure.
that the scientists were able to imagine, or any other particular groups like Black
Yeah.
Panther.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, when we think of different, whether it be autonomous zones like the Zapatistas in Chiapas, or when we think of the YPG and Kurdish revolutionaries in so-called northern Syria, in Rojava, who have resisted the state and have created their own, not state, but communities. And the question of policing always comes up. And I think first we have to address community policing as an alternative to contemporary forms of policing. So not community policing, not from any radical.
Se puede regir a sí misma de una forma policíaca en lugar de un sistema policíaco. Y algo que representa esa fuerza policíaca, que representa esa misma comunidad y esa misma lugar geográfico. Y yo pienso que en cuanto a proteger una comunidad y sus gentes, o sus personas, especialmente de peligros que vienen desde afuera.
And just blatant Nazism is alive and well. So, this is not meant to simplify social relations and that everyone should just get along, but that instead we should turn to not solving social problems with policing and prisons as well.
Okay. And do we have time for more? I saw another one was dismissed, but if we do, I guess someone asks what you feel is the importance of Marxism in particular in incorporating those kinds of practices, or
Yeah, and I'll keep this brief for the sake of time. I think Marxism, and it's very important to first distinguish. It's important to distinguish between Karl Marx, right, and Marxism. And if we talk about Karl Marx and the way he talked about colonized people, and we can find that problematic. But Marxism, the study of how what's known as dialectical materialism, or the studying of how throughout history what produces societies are economic relations and how they are structured. We can use Marxism as an understanding and an analysis and a lens, and not the final solution to different issues. And when we think of Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, these are all self-proclaimed Marxists. And there are a sloth of academic Marxists of color as well, who have drawn the links from racial capitalism to different aspects. So I think Marxism, if we look at it also with a critical race analysis, it can be very useful.